A phone rings inside the Clay County Sheriff's Office in Florida. It's an ordinary line on an ordinary summer morning. Nobody picking it up has any idea that the call is about to reopen one of the coldest cases in the office's history. On the other end is a man. He is 70 years old. He has spent almost 4 decades not talking about what he's calling about now. He isn't reporting a new crime. He isn't asking for help. He tells the sergeant on the line that he wants to set things straight. The case he's calling about is a killing that happened before some of the detectives who will eventually work it were even born. A young mother, bludgeoned to death in her own bedroom. Her infant daughter left crying, alone, in the next room. Her name was Melissa Taylor Allison. Everyone who loved her called her Missy. For 38 years, Missy's murder sat unsolved. Her mother died still waiting for an answer. Her daughter grew up, had a daughter of her own, and carried a grief she couldn't fully name because she had no memory of the woman she was grieving. And then, on July 8th, the silence broke. What could a man possibly know about a murder after 38 years? And why, after all that time, would he choose that exact moment to finally speak? To understand what that phone call meant, to understand why it mattered so much to so many people who had almost given up hope, we have to go back. Not to the phone call, not even to the crime scene. We have to go back to the life of a 20-year-old woman named Missy. Before Melissa Taylor Allison became a case number, she was a person. She was 20 years old. She was a mother. She had a 13-month-old daughter named Casey, a baby just old enough to stand, to reach for her mother's hands, to know her mother's voice. Jacksonville, Florida, in the late 1980s was a city growing fast, a mix of working-class neighborhoods, military families, and young people starting out. It was the kind of place where a young mother like Missy could rent a home with roommates, raise her daughter, and build a life one ordinary day at a time. That's the part that's easy to lose in true crime stories. Before anything else, Missy was living an ordinary life. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a mystery. She was a young woman raising a baby, doing what young mothers do, worrying about bills, about sleep schedules, about the next stage of a daughter's life. Here's what makes a cold case like this one so disorienting, if you really sit with it. It isn't only that investigators don't have an answer. It's that life keeps moving while the victim stays frozen in time. Missy's daughter grew up. Missy's mother grew older, then old, then gone. She died in 2019, more than 30 years after her daughter's murder, still not knowing what had happened to her. Neighborhoods changed. Detectives retired. New detectives took their place, inheriting a file instead of a memory. And through all of it, one question sat untouched in a box of old paperwork. Who killed Missy? At some point on the night she died, Missy stopped being able to tell anyone what happened to her. From that moment forward, every answer, if there was ever going to be one, would have to come from someone else. Someone who was there. Someone who knew. For 38 years, that someone said nothing. But soon, investigators would be standing in a bedroom, facing a scene that raised far more questions than it answered. On December 28, 1987, Melissa Taylor Allison was found dead in her bedroom. According to the arrest report later filed in the case, it was her own roommates who found her. They were the ones who discovered that the young woman they shared a home with, the mother of the baby down the hall, was gone. The medical examiner's office would go on to rule her death a homicide. The cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Somewhere in that house, on that night, in the days just after Christmas, a 13-month-old girl had been left crying, alone, in the living room, while her mother lay dead in the next room. Try to sit with that for a second, not as a plot detail, as a fact about two human beings, a mother and a daughter, whose lives were violently and permanently changed within the same terrible hour. Investigators arriving at the scene would have been working the way homicide detectives worked in 1987, without DNA databases, without cell phone records, without the digital trail that solves so many modern cases almost by accident. They had a body. They had a residence. They had roommates who found her. And they had a set of urgent, unanswered questions. Who last saw Missy alive? What happened in the hours before her death? Who had access to the home that night? Was this the act of someone Missy knew? Or a stranger? And was there anyone, anywhere, who knew more than they were saying. At first, investigators had something every homicide detective needs to begin building a case: a crime scene, a victim, a starting point. What they didn't have, what they would not have for 38 years, was the one thing they needed most: the identity of the person responsible. In the days and weeks after Missy's death, detectives would have done what homicide investigators always do at the start of a case: work outward from a body. They would have canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed the roommates who found her, tried to reconstruct her final hours, who she'd spoken to, where she'd been, whether anything in the home was disturbed, whether anything was missing. They would have looked at her relationships, anyone who knew her, anyone who might have wanted to hurt her, or who might simply have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is the part of an investigation that rarely makes it into the headlines, because it isn't dramatic. It's methodical. It's slow. Detectives ask a question. They wait for an answer. Sometimes the answer leads somewhere. Sometimes it leads nowhere at all. Investigators had a question. Then, somewhere in that process, they would have found something, a lead, a name, a piece of physical evidence, that appeared to give them a direction to move in. But that direction didn't lead to an arrest. Here is the uncomfortable truth about homicide investigations, especially in an era before advanced forensic science. They depend almost entirely on information. If a witness doesn't know something, the case stalls. If a witness forgets details over time, the case stalls. If evidence is incomplete, contaminated, or simply doesn't exist in a form that can identify a suspect, the case stalls. And if someone who does know something decides, for whatever reason, to stay silent, the case can stall for a very, very long time. According to the arrest report that would eventually be filed decades later, no arrests were made during that initial investigation into Melissa Ellison's killing. The leads that existed in 1987 and 1988 did not connect to a name. Detectives worked the file as far as it would take them. And then, the way so many cases do, it began to slow down. And as the years began passing, Missy's case faced the enemy that quietly destroys so many unsolved investigations: time. There's a common misconception about what it means for a case to go cold. It doesn't mean the police stopped caring. It doesn't mean the file got closed and forgotten in some literal sense. What it means is that the investigation ran out of an active path, a lead strong enough to keep moving the case toward an arrest. Picture it as a kind of long unraveling. The 1980s become the 1990s. The 1990s become the 2000s. The 2000s become the 2010s. Somewhere in a records room, a case file marked with Missy's name sits in a box, occasionally pulled out, reviewed, and put back. The detectives who worked the case originally retire. Some pass away. New detectives are assigned to cold case units, investigators who never met Missy, never worked her original scene, and only know her through paperwork typed on machines that don't exist anymore. Technology moves forward around the case, even while the case itself stands still. DNA testing becomes commonplace. Digital record-keeping replaces filing cabinets. Investigative techniques that didn't exist in 1987 become standard practice by the 2000s and 2010s. And through every single one of those changes, one fact remains exactly the same: nobody has been arrested for killing Missy. Now imagine being her family during all of that. Imagine being her mother, Catherine Taylor, watching years turn into decades without ever hearing the word she was waiting for: "We know who did it." Imagine being her daughter, Casey, a girl who has no memory of her own mother, only a story she was told, and a wound that never got the chance to heal because it never got the chance to close. By the time Missy's case entered its fourth decade unsolved, most people who'd never met her might have assumed it would stay that way forever. Cold cases, statistically, are hard to solve. The odds get longer with every passing year. But a cold case is never completely dead. Somewhere, there may still be a person carrying a piece of the truth, waiting, for reasons only they understand, for the moment they are finally ready to speak. 38 years is not a short amount of time to carry a secret. It's long enough for a baby to grow into a woman, get married, have children of her own. It's long enough for a mother to grow old and die without ever getting the answer she spent 3 decades waiting for. It's long enough for an entire city to change. New buildings, new streets, new generations who never heard Missy's name. If someone out there knew something about what happened to her, that knowledge sat inside them through all of it. We can't know, with certainty, why that silence lasted so long. What we can do is lay out the kinds of reasons investigators would eventually have to consider, without pretending any one of them is confirmed fact. Was someone afraid of what would happen if they spoke up? Did someone convince themselves, over the years, that staying silent was easier than facing what they knew? Did someone carry guilt they never resolved, letting it calcify into silence simply because that's what silence does when it's left alone long enough? Investigators wouldn't be in a position to know the answer to any of that until someone actually came forward. And even then, coming forward with information is only the first step. Investigators would still have to determine whether that information was genuine, whether it lined up with the facts of the case, or whether it was something else entirely. But something was about to shift. After 38 years of silence, the story was about to move out of the past and into the present. Then came July 8th. July 8th began like any other day. Nothing about the morning suggested that a murder silent for more than 38 years was about to be reopened. But inside the Clay County Sheriff's Office, a phone call was about to change that. A man called in, saying he wanted to come forward with information about a cold case. According to the arrest report, he told the sergeant who answered that he wanted to set things straight regarding the death of a 20-year-old woman named Melissa Ellison, killed decades earlier. For a moment, sit with what that phone call must have felt like on the other end of the line. A sergeant, going about a normal shift, suddenly holding a conversation that connects directly to one of the office's oldest unsolved homicides. Who was this man? What exactly did he know? How did he know it? And the question that would define everything that followed, why now, after 38 years, was he finally calling? The man would later be identified as Gary Glowax, 70 years old, from Middleburg, Florida, according to law enforcement records, a location only about half a mile from the home where Melissa Ellison had been living at the time of her death. That call was passed along, and the case was routed to detectives with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, investigators whose entire job is built around exactly this kind of moment. An old case, suddenly, unexpectedly, alive again. For the first time in decades, someone was voluntarily stepping forward with information about what happened to Missy. But telling investigators you have information is one thing. Proving that information holds up is another matter entirely. There's an important distinction in cases like this one. The difference between a confession and information about a crime. When investigators receive either one, they can't simply take it at face value. People sometimes falsely confess to crimes for complicated psychological reasons that have nothing to do with actual guilt. Other times, someone claims to have information that turns out to be secondhand, mistaken, or simply wrong. So when Gary Glowax got in touch with the Clay County Sheriff's Office, and the case was handed to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit, detectives faced a series of questions they had to work through carefully. What exactly was he claiming? According to the arrest report, Glowax told detectives that in March of that year, he came across an article detailing Melissa Ellison's case, and, in reading it, realized he was responsible for her death. He told detectives he had struck her with a log during a burglary, while looking for money or items he could sell for drugs, according to the report. Investigators would have needed to weigh several things. Did the details he provided match the physical evidence from the original 1987 scene? Details that wouldn't have been publicly available? Did his account line up with what investigators already understood about how Missy died, including the cause of death recorded by the medical examiner? Blunt force trauma to the head? Could any part of his story be independently corroborated? This is the point in an investigation where the language has to be precise, because the stakes are so high. Investigators don't get to say a case is solved just because someone called and said something dramatic. They have to say, instead, that the caller provided information investigators believed was significant enough to pursue. That distinction matters, for the case, and for fairness to everyone involved. But after 38 years of silence, investigators finally had something they hadn't had in a very long time. A new direction. Reopening a homicide investigation from 1987 in the year 2026 means bridging two completely different eras of policing. In 1987, investigators worked with paper files, typewritten reports, and physical evidence stored in boxes that would sit in an evidence room for decades. There was no searchable digital database connecting a name in Middleburg to a case file in Jacksonville. There was no easy way to cross-reference a residence half a mile from a crime scene against a list of unresolved leads. Investigators worked with what they could gather by hand, by phone, by knocking on doors. By 2026, the tools available to a cold case unit look almost nothing like that. Detectives can compare new information against decades-old case files stored digitally. They can apply modern investigative and forensic techniques, where evidence still exists and can still be tested, to questions that couldn't be answered in 1987 or 1988. When the cold case unit picked up Glowac's call, their job became about reconciling those two eras, taking a decades-old file, built by investigators who are long retired, and testing it against a claim made by a 70-year-old man in the present day. That meant reviewing the original reports, comparing his account against the documented facts of the case, the date, the location, the cause of death, the circumstances under which Melissa Ellison was found by her roommates. Looking at whether his account of a burglary gone wrong, a search for money to buy drugs, and a struggle that ended with a blow from a log was consistent with what investigators already knew. Technology can help an investigation move faster. It can help verify details that would once have taken months to confirm. But technology alone cannot replace the truth. Somebody still has to be the one who explains what happened, and somebody still has to be willing to say it. After nearly 4 decades, there was one question investigators couldn't escape. Could this new information actually survive scrutiny? While detectives worked to verify what they'd been told, the story circled back, as it always does, to the people who had been waiting the longest. Missy's daughter, Casey Ellison, was 13 months old when her mother was killed. She grew up without any memory of her, only a story passed down, a photograph, a hole in the shape of a person she never really got to know. For much of her life, Casey has said she felt like she had to shrink her feelings about her mother's death, bury them, because there was no resolution to attach them to, no ending to the story that might let her grieve fully and move forward. It wasn't until about 25 years after the murder, when Casey's own daughter reached the same age Casey had been when Missy died, that something shifted. Looking at her own child, Casey realized she was looking at a reflection of herself as an infant, in the exact moment her world had been shattered. It gave her a new, deeply personal understanding of just how much had been taken, and from how young an age. Missy's mother, Catherine Taylor, spent more than 30 years hoping for an answer that never came. In 2019, she died without ever learning what happened to her daughter. A year before that, according to reporting on the case, a friend of the family submitted Melissa Ellison's story to Project Cold Case, a non-profit organization that supports the families of unsolved homicide victims. The organization built a page dedicated to her case, gathering the details the family had collected over decades, keeping her name and her story visible to anyone who might one day have information to share. For most people, 38 years is close to an entire lifetime. For Missy's family, it was 38 years of a single question that never stopped being asked, even after the person who might have answered it, Catherine Taylor, was no longer alive to hear the response. But the phone call from Gary Glowax had changed one thing. Investigators were no longer looking only backward at an unsolved file. For the first time in decades, they were looking forward at the real possibility of finally giving this family an answer. Before any case moves toward a resolution, there's a stretch of time where everything slows down, where the excitement of a breakthrough has to be tested against the discipline of an actual investigation. Why did Glowax wait so long to come forward? According to what he told detectives, it was reading an article about the case in March that led him to recognize his own role in Melissa Ellison's death, a recognition that, by his account, eventually led him to make the call in July. Was the information he gave independently confirmed by anything beyond his own statements? Could it be connected to physical evidence, anything preserved from the original 1987 investigation that might still exist to be examined. Would it be enough, on its own, to support formal charges? A phone call is not automatically proof. A claim is not automatically evidence. A lead, even a compelling one, is not automatically a solved case. That distinction is what separates careful investigative work from a story that just sounds satisfying. After 38 years, detectives didn't have the luxury of simply accepting the account they'd been given. They had to test it against everything they already knew. And that is where a cold case can change completely. The moment a story stops being just a story and starts becoming evidence. Here is what happened next, according to the arrest report and subsequent charging documents. Glowax told detectives with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit that he had been in Melissa Allison's home the night she died, searching for money or items he could sell for drugs. He told them he struck her with a log. He told them this happened during what investigators would characterize, based on his account, as a burglary that turned violent. Detectives compared this account against the established facts of the case. The December 28, 1987 date, the discovery of Melissa Allison's body in her bedroom by her roommates, and a medical examiner's ruling that her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. His account was consistent with those facts. Investigators also noted, through law enforcement databases, that Glowax's known residence was only about half a mile from the home where Melissa Allison had been living, a detail that added weight to the plausibility of his account, placing him within easy reach of the scene. Based on the totality of that information, Gary Glowax was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and armed burglary with assault or battery. For 38 years, the case had been defined entirely by what investigators didn't know. Now, they had a confession that matched the evidence they did have. He was being held without bond in the Duval County Jail. His attorney and the district attorney's office both declined to comment publicly on the case as it moved toward its next court appearance. The question that had haunted this case since December of 1987 finally had an answer investigators believed they could stand behind. It's worth pausing here, because the most important part of this story isn't really about Gary Glowax. It's about what it means that this case moved at all. For 38 years, nothing about Missy's case changed. Detectives retired. Technology transformed. A mother died without answers. A daughter grew up and had a daughter of her own. And through every bit of that change, the file sat exactly where it had always been, unsolved. Then one person, for reasons that trace back to reading an article and, by his own account, recognizing himself in it, picked up a phone. That single decision reopened an investigation that had outlasted decades of changing detectives, changing technology, and changing generations. It's a reminder of something that cold case investigators know better than almost anyone. A case doesn't need new evidence to be found in order to move forward. Sometimes, it just needs one person to finally decide to talk. Let's go back to where we started. A phone rings inside the Clay County Sheriff's Office. A man is on the other end, ready, after 38 years, to say something he had never said before. Investigators listen, and a mystery that had sat frozen since 1987 suddenly, unexpectedly, has a new chapter. It would be easy to let this story end with an arrest, a courtroom, a headline. But that's not where Missy's story should end. Melissa Missy Taylor Allison shouldn't be remembered only as the young mother whose murder went unsolved for 38 years. She should be remembered as a 20-year-old woman who was raising a daughter, building a life, and had every reason to expect she'd get to watch that daughter grow up. She didn't get that. But her daughter, Casey, did grow up, carrying her mother's memory even without being able to remember her directly, and eventually raising a child of her own who, in a strange and moving way, gave Casey a new understanding of exactly what had been taken from both of them on that night in December 1987. Missy's death created a question that outlived her mother, who passed away in 2019 still waiting for an answer. It's a question her daughter carried for decades. And it's a question that, after 38 years of silence, someone finally came forward with information that could help answer. Time buried this investigation beneath decades of silence. It didn't erase Missy's name. Picture the phone again, ringing, then answered. 38 years is long enough for a lot of people to assume a case has been forgotten. But a cold case isn't necessarily a forgotten case. Somewhere, someone may still be carrying a piece of the truth, for reasons only they understand, waiting for the moment they are finally ready to speak. If you were carrying information about a murder for 38 years, what would it take to finally make you pick up the phone? And if that phone call could finally give a grieving family an answer, would you make it? Melissa Taylor Ellison, 38 years. Then the phone rang. If you want to hear the next case we investigate, subscribe, because the next story gets even stranger.